All right, so to start out, I'm gonna create a new JavaScript project, not even a React project, just gonna demonstrate some asynchronous programming concepts. All right, just a blank JavaScript file, so we can learn about asynchronous programming. Okay, so let's first look. I'm going to just make a function that waits. So we can just see a little bit about how we can, handle time passing in JavaScript. Okay. So just looking at this basic program that I've coded up here, let's make some estimates. How long do we think it's going to take this program to execute? So here's some guesses.
6 seconds.
Okay.
11,001 milliseconds.
Okay. I like the precision there. So we see Quebec, waiting 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Doesn't seem like we're getting these console logs. What is going on here?
I think your while
Isn't
loop
it always less than that in the while loop?
Is this just backwards? No. So that demo did not work out exactly how I'd hoped.
Would it be get time instead of get date on line 3?
Definitely. Okay, so 5 seconds later, we see the hello log. And then 6 seconds later, we get the world log for a total execution time of 11 seconds. Thank you, Jim, for pointing out the mistake there. So this is, let me think how to put this. Like by default, a lot of code runs this way. It'll run synchronously, one thing after another. Commonly, this is not what we want to happen. We would rather multiple things can happen simultaneously or in parallel or asynchronously, or kind of similar words to describe similar situations. So I'm going to refactor this a little bit so that these things can run at the same time. So we've still got our wait function. Bao, question?
Before you move on, do you mind just went through the code within the wait function real quick?
Sure. So this is just setting the time of whenever this function was invoked. New date just gets the current time. Get time gets that in milliseconds. And then here we just have a while loop that doesn't actually do anything, but it just kind of takes up time. And so as long as the current time is less than whenever we started plus however long we want to wait for, then we keep looping. So this is just going to wait indefinitely, just keep spinning in circles doing nothing until the time when we started plus the amount of time that we're waiting for is greater than the current time.
Also, just to make sure, is that a new word? Is it like a built-in thing for JavaScript? That's kind of
New, yeah, this is built in. So this is for object-oriented programming in JavaScript. When you're creating a new instance of a class, you use the new keyword. This is different from Python. Python doesn't quite have anything like this. But in JavaScript, when you're creating a new instance of a class, we use the new keyword. So the date object is actually a class in JavaScript. So to create a new date, one way that we do that is with the new keyword like this. All right, so now I've coded up a very slightly different version of the same function, of the same program, but now it should be working asynchronously in that both these jobs are going to be going on in the background simultaneously. So we've got one 5-second timer and one 6-second timer that should be independent of each other. So we don't have one of these tasks waiting for the other, but they're both going on in the background simultaneously. So this is roughly what we're trying to achieve here, being able to control multiple tasks going on in the background simultaneously. So practically, we're not going to do this actually just with set timeout and these kinds of like infinite while loops or whatever. But the proper way to do this in JavaScript is with promises. So we showed you before how to use promises as they're provided to you by various other frameworks, such as Axios will provide promises as the return value for any method. But at this point, I want to do a slightly deeper dive. And so we're going to learn how to create our own promises. Okay. So just remember for context, when you send a request using Axios, and then it returns immediately, like you don't get the data immediately, you get a promise object, something you can call .then off of. And then eventually, that promise object will give you the data you wanted in the .then callback. So that's what we're creating here. We're creating one of those promises like what Axios would provide us. So we've done the first half of this, which is consuming them after we've been provided them. But here we're going to learn how to actually create them initially. So promises are built into the browser and they're built into Node. There's a class called promise with a capital P. So I'm going to create a new promise. And so a promise, to create one, takes one argument. It's a function saying like, what should the promise do? But when this function gets called, it's going to get two arguments passed into it. So commonly these are called resolve and reject. I know the syntax looks a little bit weird at first, but I think as I get further through this demo, this will be a little bit more clear. So inside of this callback function here for the promise, this is where we do any kind of asynchronous work. But ultimately, what needs to happen in the promise is that we resolve a value. So remember when you call .then on the promise, and then the value gets passed in to the callback function as the data. So that's the resolved value of the promise. So let's say we just resolve 10. So let's just test this out. So here I've just manually created a promise. It doesn't do anything particularly interesting, like send an API request and then resolve articles or resolve the response from the API, just resolving a hard-coded number. But let's just see how this works just in a basic way. So this resolved immediately because I'm not actually doing anything that takes a long time. And I call .then with the data passed in as the parameter for my callback, and it gives me the value that was resolved previously. But now sometimes our promises don't work out the way we expect them to. Like maybe you send an API request and the server isn't online. Maybe they crashed and they're just down temporarily, or you sent a bad request and they're not able to give you a response. So in some cases, you can tell in your code that the promise isn't working the way it should. So in those cases, you reject the promise. So commonly when you reject a promise, you pass an error in, because generally the reason why you would reject a promise is because an error was thrown. So let's see here, if I just run the code now, so this is going to throw an error. It's telling me unhandled promise rejection warning, error, oops, saying that my promise was rejected, but I didn't have any plan in place to handle that. So I have a .then handling my promise, but I need to catch errors potentially if they happen. So I'm going to add a .catch. So let's try this again. Okay, so here, this is not an unhandled error, but in this case, I created my promise. And the first thing it does is reject itself. So then when I call my promise.then, this line never actually runs because the promise did not resolve. But what we're seeing now is because the promise was rejected, instead the catch block is running, and whatever we pass into reject, this gets passed into catch as the error. So you notice error is oops. That's just what I console log, or that's just what I passed in over here. And it's giving me the full stack trace of the error. Which is not super useful because the code is compiled, but still good that it's there. We saw a hand up just now. Who has a question?
I had a question on the premise of new, on the new promise. What happens if we forget the new piece? What is the error that usually will probably pop up for us or something?
I don't know, let's find out. So I guess it just doesn't make a promise. I'm not exactly sure if I understand this error, but definitely didn't work. And we definitely need to have the new keyword there in order to create promises.
Okay, it's just something to look out if I, accidentally switched to JavaScript and forgot the new. So I was just like, want to point to say, oh, I know what that one is. Okay.
It's definitely an easy mistake to make. I feel like I've done that a few times, switching back and forth between Python and JavaScript. So it's a little unfortunate, I think, that the error message didn't tell us exactly what was wrong, but at least it tells us where the error is. So if you're thinking like, wow, like doesn't like my promises, maybe I should just Google like how to write a promise in JS. And then you'd probably find some code snippet, maybe like, oh, I forgot the new keyword. Of course, that's what I need. So hopefully based on this error message, you could figure out the problem without too much difficulty. But also, yeah, just having seen this error message once, you're more likely to recognize it again in the future. Andrew, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had another question. So what if your promise neither returns a resolve or reject? Then your my promise.then will never run, right?
So for one thing, the promise doesn't return anything. These functions get called inside of the promise callback. So I would rephrase your question as, what if the promise doesn't call resolve or reject? And so then in that case, your promise would be pending indefinitely. Let's see if we can actually look this up here. Is it? Okay, yeah. So in the MDN article here, a promise is in one of three states. So it starts off as pending, meaning that it has not been resolved or rejected. When you call resolve or reject, it gets put into one of these other two states. So if for whatever reason, your promise never calls resolve or reject, it'll just be in a pending state forever. The client is going to think that like the request is still pending. Like maybe you sent a request to an API and the API is still thinking, they just haven't responded to you yet, which is not correct. Generally, it's more likely that you just coded a bug and you forgot to call resolve or reject. Like if the API doesn't respond to you, there should be a timeout in your code somewhere that just calls reject. If you don't hear back from the API in like 10 seconds or whatever, 5 seconds, you have to set your own limit, your own standards.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one way or the other, this this promise callback should call either resolve or reject in all cases. So there should probably be error handlers inside of here to make sure that reject is called if everything else goes wrong. Yeah, just in this demo, I don't quite have time to handle all of the failure cases. And I'm not even sending a real API request here. So there aren't really like failures to handle. So I'm gonna make this example a little bit more interesting instead of just hard coding in the reject or resolve. I'm gonna make another function. So we're going to generate a random number and then just check if that is greater than 0.25. So 75% of the time it will be, 25% of the time it will not. So we'll check that out here. Okay, here's a slightly more realistic, slightly more plausible looking promise. So here we're trying to model performing some action that may or may not be successful. So, do something, let's say we're saying an API request. Sometimes like you send a bad request, maybe there's just a random error on the network. Sometimes things fail for like no reason. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong, but you need to be prepared to handle the errors. So when this promise is created, we're going to generate a random number. If it's greater than 0.25, we resolve the promise with this message. If it is less than 0.25, we will reject the promise with this message. And then in our like application code here, we're checking if it is resolved or rejected and then running code accordingly. Okay, so I ran it once. Looks like the promise was resolved. Okay, so I ran it. That was actually like statistically perfect because we should have a 25% chance of failure here. So I ran it 3 times, got 3 consecutive successes. And the 4th time randomly it failed. We do something, returned a number less than 0.25. And so we rejected with this error, oops. All right, so does anyone have any questions so far about promises, the callback they take, the resolve, the reject method? I know this looks kind of bizarre when you see it for the first time, so please ask questions. Anybody? Nobody?
Raphael, could you just run through the whole thing one more time?
Sure. So at the very top, just the do something function, just very basic, returns a random number between 0 and 1 and tells us if that number is greater than 0.25. So 75% of the time, it's going to be yes, it's going to be true. 25% of the time, it's going to be false. Okay, so here on line 18, we are creating a promise. And now something that I think a lot of people miss about promises is that on line 18, when I create this promise, this code runs immediately. So it doesn't wait until I call .then to do this asynchronous code. But as soon as I create the promise on line 18, it is calculating, do something to assign to success to figure out if we can resolve or reject this promise. I know I've seen other people have the mistaken belief that the promise does nothing at all until you call .then, and that's not true. The promise, as soon as it is created, will do the work that is described in its callback function. And then it'll try to resolve or reject as soon as possible, tries to get out of that pending state as soon as possible. But then it doesn't like do anything with that response until you call .then or .catch off of it. So on line 18, I'm creating a promise that is immediately calculating this value success. It's just a Boolean value, true or false, depending on whether do something returns greater or less than 0.25. And then we're kind of defining based on what happens in our asynchronous code or whatever code happens in our promise, was that successful or not? Because like JavaScript doesn't know automatically like what constitutes success. We're just telling it to do a bunch of logic, and there's a whole variety of results that could happen. And so we're going to have to tell JavaScript like, oh, if you get this back from the API, that's a good thing. We're going to resolve that value. Oh, but actually, if the API returns this other value, that's a bad thing. We're going to reject that value. Like if the API returns an error message. Now, it doesn't always mean that an error was thrown. So like axios, for example, if the API returns an error, like a 404 error, axios will sometimes not consider that an error because the server did successfully give a response. It successfully gave you an error response, but it did successfully give you a response. So you might check here, like if response.status code is 404, then you reject with an error 404, something like that. So this is how we define if the results of this promise, the results of this logic is successful or not. Here it's just kind of hard-coded based on the true or false from this do something, but in practical applications might be based on something more complicated. But then nothing actually happens with the promise until I try to call .then off of it. So when I call .then off of our promise, if the promise was resolved, then this callback function runs. If the promise was rejected, this callback function does not run. So ideally, this .catch block never runs because the promise is resolved. We don't have to handle any errors, but inevitably errors will happen sometimes. So if the promise is rejected, that is, if we create the promise on line 18, do something returns a number less than 0.25, and so then we have to call reject. Then in that case, we get thrown into this catch block where we run this code. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. What other questions do we have?
I've got one, Rafael.
Let's hear it.
I almost feel like kind of silly for asking it, but like, are there like programs or situations where we have like dual promises running at the same time and only like the first one to complete gets its thing done? Almost like video games, like.
This is not a problem that I've had to solve in the past, but there is built-in functionality in JavaScript to handle that situation. So on the, let's see, so what I've just shown you right here is just handling an individual promise. Just whenever this one promise is done, run some code if it succeeds, run some other code if it fails. What I'll show you more as I'm building the news site later this morning is that the promise class itself, so you'll note capital P promise, has a bunch of built-in methods that let you handle your promises in more sophisticated ways. The one that I'm going to show you today is promise.all. This is actually the only method on the promise class that I've used, the only like static promise method I've used. It's pretty useful. But there's a bunch of other ones here for describing other situations. So what you're talking about where like you have a whole bunch of asynchronous actions happening at the same time, and you only care about the first one that happens, then you could use promise.race. So I'm imagining a situation like if you're trying to get data about, so let's say it's not like a user, not something in your database. Let's like a date, you're trying to get information about a Pokemon. So I showed you a Pokemon API earlier in this cohort, but there's also probably a bunch of other Pokemon APIs. And let's say that they're all like kind of slow and buggy and unreliable because like nobody gets paid to maintain a Pokemon API. So on a day-by-day basis, like maybe one of them is going to be down or one of them is going to be really slow or something. So if you want to build like a really robust application that depends on Pokemon data, you might build it so that whenever someone requests information about a Pokemon, you send like 6 requests to 6 different APIs and then just use the data from whichever one resolves first using promise.race, assuming that they're all going to give you the same data, but just that one of them is going to resolve first and then some of them won't resolve at all, but you only care about one of them. So that's a contrived situation that I just thought of right now that uses promise.race. But yeah, in my professional career, that's not a problem that I've ever been asked to solve.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a fun explanation.
Cool. I'm glad you liked it. I think I saw another hand. Marcus, did you have a question?
Yeah, that was a good explanation, just to reiterate that. But if you could like briefly explain the difference between like async await and a promise, how would you summarize that? Or if they're even the same at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are going to demonstrate that shortly in this demo, but the most concise way that I can explain it is that if you have a promise that you could call .then off of, you can instead await that promise to get the actual value it would resolve to. So like you've seen the usual flow where you have a function that returns a promise, like here we got a promise, and you have to call .then off of it. And then if there's more asynchronous stuff I want to do inside of this, I would have to, call .then inside of some promise inside of here, and then just indent more and more deeply. They call that callback hell, when you have to just constantly indent in order to do one thing after another. And we might demo that later this morning. But so instead of just saying promise.then, we should be able to So specifically, this is an async function. Wait. It's an async function. Okay, so I've created the promise. So note that I'm not calling it or anything because the promise already exists. So I'm just awaiting the promise and then assigning that to a value, assigning it to a variable. And we will console log the awaited value. Oh, and then I have to call do stuff. Okay, there it succeeded. So we got the console.log success. Because remember, promise, if success, we resolve success. So that's the actual resolved value. So that got assigned to a weighted value. Let's do this a few more times. Okay. Now, when the promise is rejected, we again get that unhandled promise rejection warning because I don't have my .catch or any equivalent kind of code here. So the way we handle that with async await is using try catch. You might remember that from previously in the curriculum. So that's coming back again. So we're going to try to await the promise and then console log its value. If there's an error, though, we'll just console log the error. So that actually failed the first time I ran it, just that 1 in 4 chance. And we're seeing that error message, oops. That error message is logging here, oops. Yeah, just to be clear, there was an error in our awaited promise from our catch block. So this is how we would handle promise rejections using await. So this is getting a little bit ahead of the lecture, but it was a really good question and pretty quick to demonstrate it. So this is a common pattern for practically how you'll manage asynchronous code in an application. You will try and then await your promises. This is my preferred style. I don't actually use .then anywhere in my own code. I avoid it as much as possible and use async await instead, because I don't really like using .catch like this. Chaining it off of the .then is just kind of a stylistic preference. I don't like looking at that. But I really like using try catch with async await. I think this reads much more similarly to synchronous code. Just like the way JavaScript normally works, where you're running one line after another just from top to bottom. Using async await lets your code run kind of more like that again, lets you read it more from top to bottom. And just in general, I think that try catch is really easy to read. So I'm really glad that async await lets me use try catch in my code. Whereas if you're using this style with the .then, the callback functions, try catch is not going to be particularly useful. You have to use this .catch method. But yeah, so this is a common pattern I've used a lot. In the try, you'll send API requests, do database access. And then if something goes wrong with any of those awaited promises, you'll get an error over here that'll tell you what went wrong. you violated a database constraint or the API you're trying to reach is inaccessible. And then you can do some if-else logic here to send an appropriate error message to the client or handle it however you think is best. Kat, question?
I was just wondering, can you use like a fetch in a try catch, or is it like redundant to do that?
Like for an API request, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Now, what I'm going to be showing you is axios, but that is like absolutely how you use axios, how you use async await. So here, instead of just await my promise, more practically, you would do something like so something like that. This is how I tend to build like node-based applications, I guess. I mean, you'd use the same pattern from the front end as well, because you can use axios on the front end and the back end. Does this help put things in perspective a little bit for you? It's making things a little more clear.
Yeah. So fetch is basically a promise as well, right? Or like axios.get is also a promise.
Yeah, axios.get returns a promise. Fetch also returns a promise. We could totally use fetch instead of axios. I just think that the axios API is a little bit simpler and easier to use. And it's also likely that you will actually be using axios at the next job you get. There's nothing wrong with fetch though, and they both return promises.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What other questions do we have?
Yeah, Rafael, in that comment right above the do stuff function, what is it? You said you can all dot then. Are you trying to say you can call dot then?
Yes, that is what I'm trying to say.
I thought that. I was just confused. And then, do you mind scrolling, or at least like pressing enter so we can see the whole comment?
The whole what?
The whole comment, like it's going off the page and we can't see the right side of it.
Oh, let me. How about that?
Perfect.
Mhm. All right, I want to code out one more quick little demo for you using promises, not using the async await style, just because I want you to see what promise chaining looks like. So the idea here is just that we have a series of actions that have to happen one after another. So we're going to use a metaphor of eating breakfast. First thing you'll have to do is wash your dishes. Then you pour cereal, you pour milk, then you will eat breakfast. And then, so that's if everything goes well. If there's an error in any of those steps, then you will be hungry. So those are general like 4 actions that we might need to chain together. We're going to pour serial. So this is going to be the second function in our chain of promise handlers. So this is actually going to get some data passed into it. Oh, we got to set some time here. So you can't wash your dishes immediately. This takes like 3 seconds. Very fast at washing dishes, just not immediate. Pouring cereal, you can do this in say 2.5 seconds. We're going to pour milk. This is even faster, just going to dump all the milk right in there. Lastly, we will eat breakfast. Okay, so I've defined a whole bunch of functions here. All of these will return a new promise. And most of them, after the first one, will accept an input also as an argument, which is the result from the previous promise. So to use these, first we're going to wash dishes. Now note that wash dishes returns a promise. Promises can be handled with .then to determine, what happens after the promise succeeds. So we can pass in a function to .then to say what we want to do afterwards. Now, normally we've just been using anonymous functions, but here we've already defined these up front. So I'm just going to pass in pour cereal. Now note, pour cereal itself returns a promise. So this is an important part about promises and promise chaining. Whenever you call .then, and then you pass in a callback function, .then always returns a promise. So here I'm explicitly returning a promise, but even if I didn't return a promise, .then would still take whatever value I do return and then turn it into a promise that resolves that value and return that. So, in these examples, we are explicitly returning new promises. But instead, we could do something like return 7, which is effectively the same as so my point here, promises always, or .then always returns a promise. So here we are manually, explicitly returning promises from .then, but even if I was lazy and I just said return 7, Even if I say return 7, dot then is not returning 7. Dot then is returning a promise that resolves to 7. But here we're actually explicitly returning promises, saying what they resolve to, so it's a little bit more clear. So dot then pour serial. So since pour serial, dot then pour serial returns a promise, we can call dot then off of promises. So I'll just do it again. Milk, and then pour milk again returns a promise. So we can call dot then off of that and eat breakfast. I just ran my main.js. Excuse me. Oh, I'm never actually
Is the-
logging.
is the
any
comment?
data. Huh?
Oh, so I thought the comment broke your dot then.
Shouldn't be a problem. You know, I can have a whole bunch of lines here, and JavaScript is going to still trust that this is connected to that. I think the issue here is I'm not actually logging any of this data. It's just getting passed through, but we're not actually logging it. So everywhere where we get a result that's passed in from the previous promise, we're just going to console log that result. Let's try it one more time. So we first wash a bowl and spoon, we pour some cereal, pour some milk, and then as soon as the milk is poured, we can eat. So this is one way of handling, you know, multiple asynchronous operations in a sequence. This is pretty clean code, and you might see this as you're reading other code bases, so it's good that you can recognize it. My personal preference is honestly not to write code like this. I really like async await, this kind of style of code. Like, I really like this. You know, I'd say in general, I'm very hesitant to learn new JavaScript features. I just think like, I already know how to write JavaScript. Why do I need to learn this new feature? But when async await was introduced to the language, I was like, yes, finally, thank you. Like, I've been waiting for years for this. It just immediately made all of my code so much better. So I'm a big fan of async await. Kat?
Can you chain promises with async await as well, or only with dot then?
I mean, I'd say that you can, but like, it looks really dumb. You wouldn't call it chaining. So like, let me think here. Didn't copy quite right. Await. Oh, right. Okay, so this should work the same way now. Why are we not getting the result though? Missing something at the moment. I might need to debug this offline. Sorry. But generally, this is how you would convert the above code using the chain.thens into async await. It doesn't even look like you're doing any like specific style. It's just you write one line of code after another.
So kind of like as a rule of thumb, if you are trying to do lots of things in one function, you'd use the .then instead.
I mean, if you're chaining a whole bunch of promises off of each other, this is the same thing though. I'm doing one promise, waiting for to finish, and then giving its value to the next promise. Or actually, so I guess these are supposed to have the result passed in. It's still not quite right. I'm not sure what I'm missing here. Oh, now it's logging that for some reason. Okay, I guess it's working now. But yeah, so this is how you do the same thing, just a series of asynchronous actions, one after another. But instead of saying .then, we just say await, await. But it's the exact same timing. I just prefer writing my code like this because I think it's more legible. Just you read it from top to bottom and things happen in order. There's no indenting. Look good?
Rafa, yeah, so the result does log it in because I see like it's logging it in twice.
Right. Yeah, because we log it inside of these actual functions. And then here I'm logging what gets taken out. So here, let's change this. Wait, no. Is that actually from the value or just because we're logging twice here? There might be a lot of
It might be
concepts.
just because it might be the console logs in there.
Oopsies. That's not the keyboard shortcut I meant to use. Okay, so the now we can eat message shows up twice because that's still hard-coded console log in here. Otherwise, it seems like we're passing things through successfully. Yeah. All right. So yeah, this is kind of my preferred coding style, I would say, using async await. Did you have another question, Ivan?
Oh, that was it.
Okay, cool. Or does anyone have another question? All right. So I think that's been enough review of async await for this morning. So why don't we take a quick break? And then when we come back, I'm gonna apply some of this stuff to our news site. Show us how we can get some actual news articles from an API. Gosh, there's a lot of chat going on here. So let's build a news app. So this is my current news app. Mine is actually probably a day behind yours because I've not added like the sections page or the search bar. But that's fine. I think we'll still be ready to move forward today. So today, what I'm going to be focused on is making this more like actual hacker news. Excuse me. So this is the website we're trying to model. So first of all, let's look at the nav bar here. Got some different sections than what's in our nav items.json file. So common sections on Hacker News, new articles, got comments, Ask Hacker News, which is just for questions, show, which is just for people, bragging about their projects, and jobs, people trying to hire other hackers. There's other sections like submit, but we're not going to worry about sections that require you to be logged in. So mostly just ask, show, jobs, the main page. So I'm going to first update my app nav so that reflects those sections. Label home. We have a label for jobs. I don't know. Not sure what the value should be. I'll come back to that later. Ask and show. Let's get rid of these other sections. And the app nav. So I'm actually not going to have a home link in nav items because we have a hard-coded home link in the app nav. So this right here is going to take me home. Home. So then this is going to loop over the other nav items. So I've got jobs, ask Hacker News, and show Hacker News. So some basic headings. They still don't do anything interesting. They didn't do anything before. They don't do anything now. So this isn't worse than it was before, but it looks a little bit closer to the website we're trying to create. So that's good. So the next thing I don't like here is that all these news articles, these are coming from the news.json file. They're not coming from any API. So that's the next thing that I would like to change is going to forget all about, where is it? It's news.json. I'm going to get that out of here. So instead, we're going to have to get the news from an API. So we're going to use Axios for getting our API data. So before we can actually use it, I'll have to install it.
Ref, I have a question about what you just did.
Yep.
The Axios install you just did, is it only for this React app or is it across your global computer?
It's just for this React app.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So yeah, it's a native concept in JavaScript that our modules are project dependent, project specific. So let's see here. How are we getting the list for my article list? Coming from props.articles. So that's on the home page. Okay, so here on the home page, we're passing in news. I don't want to do that. Not using that news JSON anymore. I'm going to import axios. Because our home page is now going to be responsible for fetching its news articles. We're going to need some hooks in order to automatically update this. Use effect and use state. So by default, the article list is just going to be an empty array. However, when the page loads, we're going to use an effect that's supposed to populate this. So use effect. It's going to take a function. It's going to do stuff. And then before I forget, I'm going to put the dependency array in. So this is an empty array saying that whatever function I write here, this is just going to happen once when the page loads. And we are going to send a GET request using Axios to the Hacker News API. But let's say I don't know how the API works. So I just Googled for Hacker News API. They have a GitHub repository that explains how the API works. It's pretty simple and it's explained in pretty good detail here. But generally, every item has an ID number, like this, for example, 121.0.0.3. So you send a request to the base URL /version0/item, and then which item do you want? Format is going to be JSON. And for these examples, they're getting the pretty format, just so it's indented nicely. So we're going to send a GET request to Okay, so when the page loads, we're going to request a bunch of stories. See what that response looks like. See, getting some errors here. Homepage.js, unexpected token, line 3. Am I still using news? Yeah, okay. We'll just say it's an empty array for now, but in the near future, we're going to need to get some articles out of this request here.
Is it, do you have to put like the little parentheses around axios? Like for React, you have to put the parentheses around it?
I shouldn't need it here because that's the default export.
I'm sorry, not parentheses. What am I talking about? Quotation marks, right? Like for axio from axios.
Oh, yes. And news is not defined. Where am I using news? JS.
Is it because you're commented out the news import?
Yep. So we're no longer choosing a random article from the news. Okay, there we go. So I've removed all the data from the news.json in the application. So now there's no articles to view. We're not throwing any errors though, so that's cool. So where was I? The home page. So this should be sending a request using Axios to the Hacker News API. Excuse me. So here's the data it gives us back. You might notice that this is very sparse data. All it gives us is the IDs for each of the stories. So I queried, the top stories. That was the URL I said here, top stories. There's a few different endpoints they had. There's best stories, news stories, top stories. I wanted the top stories. But all it gives me is IDs to the other items, to the stories themselves. So the next thing I'm going to have to do here is send some more AJAX requests to get information about these individual stories. So for this demo application, I'm not going to get 500 stories to put in the homepage. We're just going to get 10 of them. So just doing a for loop here from 0 to 9. Now I'm going to create a bunch of promises in this for loop here, and I want to keep track of them. So I'm going to put them in an array here. So for 0 to 9, I'm looping through the first 10 responses from the top stories. So we're just going to render the top 10 stories instead of the top 500. And for each of those guys, we're sending a request using Axios to this URL. But remember, axios.get returns a promise. And so I want to get a list of promises. So I'm going to push all those promises into this array, which I've creatively named promises. Now, in order to handle all of these promises when they finish, I'm going to use a built-in method on the promise class called promise.all. So I'm pretty sure we saw this just moments ago. So yeah, in the documentation I was showing you, promise.all or promise.all is the first one they list, but there's a few other methods in the promise class. So promise.all, instead of running all of our promises one after another, which is what we were doing before with like .then, async await, promise.all will run all of our promises simultaneously as fast as possible. And then once they've all finished, we can run a callback function that will handle the response, handle the results. So we're gonna promise.all. Now we have to pass in the promises. So I create an array of promises here, push a whole bunch of promises in from axios.get, call promise.all with that list of promises. And then off of this, I can call .then with the responses. Note plural responses. So promise.all is going to give you a list of resolved values for all of the promises passed in. So here, once all of the promises have resolved, we can set them into state. Remember, the response itself has a lot of information like about the API response, like the status code, HTTP headers, other stuff that we don't really need in our application state. So instead of just storing the whole response as the article, I'm just storing response.data. Okay, so here our article list, instead of just looking at an empty array, let's actually look at articles. Yeah, so this state value that I'm setting here based on the response from this API, we're going to render that on the home page. That's the articles, the list of articles that our article list is going to use. Okay, so it looks like this is at least partially working. We've got something displaying on the page. So that's cool. But not all of the information is being displayed here. So let's look in the article list component. So article list is rendering a bunch of article teasers, which get the whole article passed in. So let's look at the article teaser, see what that's doing with it. So looks like we got the props.title is coming in correctly. So the Hacker News API gives us a title. So yeah, this is data coming back from the Hacker News API. It's formatted somewhat similarly to the news.json in that it also has a title attribute. But some things are a little bit different. So with the previous version of this application, we're expecting a props.created date to be passed in. But what we're getting now is time. And so this maybe doesn't look like a date to many of you. Does anyone recognize this time value?
Is it like an ISO string?
How do you mean?
I don't remember how. I know I've converted a time object to an ISO string to use it as like a unique ID or something like that.
So
I don't really know that.
it's not an ISO string. It's just an integer. But how could we measure time with just an integer?
Could it be the amount of time that's passed since like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 or something?
Yes. What is 0, 0, 0, 0 though?
Is it like 1900 or something like that? 1800? I can't remember. I think it's right around there though.
Pretty close. I'll just give it to you at this point. So what you're looking at there is a Unix timestamp. It's the idea that on like Linux and Unix machines, the way that they keep track of time is just with a single integer known as the Unix time, which just describes the number of seconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970. This is a totally arbitrary date. I don't know why that date was chosen, but this is considered to be like the birth of computing, is January 1st, 1970. This also means that it's very awkward and kind of difficult to store dates before 1970 in a computer system, especially if you need them to interact with like other dates that are after 1970. Like you have to, cleverly think of one way to handle your dates that handles any date you need to handle. So this isn't a perfect system. It doesn't like perfectly represent every possible time, but it is pretty reliable. If you know, the number of seconds since 1970 and you know a user's time zone, then that's enough to figure out like a time that you can display to the user. So this is pretty common that web applications will store dates and times as Unix time instead of like date strings or date objects. There's this handy dandy website that will convert timestamps into actual dates. So if I just try to take this time, dump it in here. It's telling me that, it's Monday, April 4th, 2022. That's what this timestamp refers to. Andrew, do you have a question?
Yeah, kind of more like a comment. Is this kind of why I realize like if I start up a computer, which I haven't turned on for like 2 years and the time isn't right, like everything like breaks. Like sometimes it won't allow you to connect to like the internet properly unless like the time is set properly before. Is it because like people are writing like time checks into like all their applications?
A lot of times, yeah. I don't know, like if there's a game that shouldn't be released until a particular date, there might be a time check in that against your system clock. Things like that. Maybe the operating system itself, like Windows has special features that aren't supposed to be unlocked until a specific date. So it might check the time for that. But in general, like if your system clock is really far off from like a publicly available internet clock, I think a lot of programs might just assume that you're like trying to hack them or do something nefarious. So they might just like refuse to operate properly. I'm not really sure though. I don't know. You're just reminding me of like old school Animal Crossing games. I don't know if anyone ever played that, but apparently like the game was supposed to happen in real time, like according to real world time. And so a lot of people would cheat by just changing the clock on their GameCube. And so like the game had built-in cheat detection that like if the clock on your GameCube didn't match like some other clock that it was expecting, like it would somehow know that you cheated and like chastise you for trying to time travel in the game. So I'm assuming that like Windows and other operating systems will do similar things, just like check if the internal clock makes sense. But
Yeah,
I don't really know.
There's a pretty funny Easter egg in like a couple games, like Metal Gear Solid 3 related to like time clock. If you like set it like 100 years forward and stuff.
It's pretty funny. Can't imagine who would like stumble upon that accidentally, but it's fun knowing that it's in there. So yeah, short answer is I don't know, but generally your computer expects the clock to be accurate. Okay, so instead of props.createDate, we're going to use props.time. All right, so that's just showing us these Unix timestamps. So I want to convert this into like an actual meaningful time that we can display to our users. So that's going to be in the article itself. Or in the article teaser, I'm sorry. Okay, so we saw in the props that we're getting props.time. So here's one other little awkward thing about JavaScript is that for the Unix timestamps, generally speaking, a Unix timestamp is supposed to be the number of seconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970. For some reason in JavaScript, they do the number of milliseconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970. So like this number is off from what we need by 1,000. So Hacker News is using proper Unix timestamps. JavaScript does not. In order to make this work in JavaScript, I'm just going to multiply this number by 1,000. Okay, so here I'm using the built-in date class in JavaScript to create a date object. So you might have used the date constructor before using date strings, but it's a pretty flexible constructor. You can pass in dates in a variety of formats and it'll give you a date object. So here, we're just passing in an integer for a Unix timestamp. And JavaScript is creating a date object based on that. Excuse me. So this is just one of those kind of awkward, unfortunate things about JavaScript, just has to be weird and different. So in order to convert this into like the more conventional format, we're going to multiply the number they give us by 1,000 to convert that from seconds to milliseconds. And then put that in props.time. So let's see what that looks like. So it's still just a date object that is just showing us the Unix time. We're going to have to actually call a method on that. Or wait, actually, I'm just rendering props.time. Let's see what the actual time is. Okay, so React doesn't like that at all because I'm trying to render an object and not a string. So we're going to call time dot to locale date string. So this formats the time to look like a date string based on the user's current time zone. So this is really important. I want to make sure people hear this, we understand this. When I create a time here based on new date with this time, there's no time zone information in this date object. It just is a number of seconds that have passed since 1970, January 1st, but without any time zone. So I think it's like Greenwich Mean Time or whatever, GMT +0 or something. But there isn't like any specific deliberate time zone information passed in here. When I call to locale date string, this formats the date object using my local machine's current time zone settings. So this same line of code will produce different output given the same input depending on what computer it runs on. Like if I'm running this code on my computer here and someone else is running the code simultaneously on the West Coast or on the Eastern Hemisphere, this code is going to return different values because it uses my browser's current time zone setting to format the date correctly. And that's what this gives us, a beautifully formatted date. All right, so it's about noon now. I don't want to go over too far, but I just want to talk a little bit about kind of next steps, what I would do to continue building on this application. So right now we've got a home page that just automatically gets a list of articles from the best articles in Hacker News. Where is it? Or no, I got top stories. So I think that's a pretty good assumption. You go to the home page, you should see the top stories. But there should also be ways to access ask, show, and job stories. So ideally, a user should be able to click on one of these links here, and it should take them to a different page. I'm gonna put you. Right, app.js. And it should take them to a different page. Call that a sections page. Sections / section ID. Element is going to be the section page, which has not been created yet. You can see that we only have the article page and the home page. But the section page is going to be very similar to the home page. The difference is that, well, whereas the home page automatically searches for top stories when it loads, this is just hard coded in here / top stories. The section page is going to have to look at props. I'll look at the params. So just like in the article page, we're doing use params to get the article ID from the URL. For the section page, we're going to have to know which section they're on. So, are they on the, let's go to nav items. Are they on the jobs section, ask Hacker News section, or show Hacker News section, or the home page? So for the section page, instead of just blindly querying for the top stories, you're going to have to use params and then check what section was requested in the section ID in the URL, and then search for that section specifically. Something a little like this. So then your section page isn't going to just get the top stories, but it'll get the top stories from the specific section you chose. But the rest of the code should be pretty similar, because once you get the IDs for those articles, you can get the full article the same way, and then the articles will have the same information. So you can render those into an article list. Every section is going to have a pretty similar article list. And then the other big difference is on the article page itself. So previously, for the article itself, let's go to the article component. We were passing in the abstract, and this was supposed to be like the text of the article. So for the Hacker News API, it's not going to give you the actual text of the article. They also won't have images or a byline. And the created date is going to be time instead. But like I just showed you, it's going to be Unix timestamp, so you have to do a little bit of work to convert it into a readable format. But so one thing that we will get now that we didn't have before is a URL. Actually, I guess we did have this before, but this is going to be more important now, is the URL linking to the actual article. So for this next version of our news site, for the actual article component, it'd be a good idea to have a button or a link of some sort. So just have an anchor that lets the user read the full URL. So in the data that we get in from the article itself, they had this URL property that shows the actual URL of the story. So here is an example. This is an article that someone thought was interesting, and so they posted it to Hacker News. So it would be cool if your news site that you build also has a link that lets the user read the full article. So just whatever the URL is. If you want to be really cool, you can do target equals _ blank. So this is kind of a sort of obscure HTML trick not a lot of people know about, but this means that the link will open in a new tab when you click on it. Target is which window do you want to open it in? You can have named targets so that like links open in specific windows, but more commonly people will use the keyword _ blank, which means that this link will open in a new window. So that's really good when you have links to external sites, because you want to make this information available to your user, but you don't want them to leave your current site. That's the reason why we're building a website is because we want people to be on it, to look at our content, look at our advertisements, maybe buy things. So our UX should generally try to keep people on our site. So target equals _ blank. That's going to cause this link to open in a new tab when it's clicked on. And also note that I use an anchor with an href instead of using the link tag from React router, because this is an external link. This isn't something that my front end client side routing is supposed to handle. This is supposed to take us off of the React application. So I'm using a just traditional anchor tag here. All right, so like I said, there's still more work to do on this news site. But based on what I've showed you and what I've described so far, I'm going to leave the remaining work as an exercise to the reader to do on your homework tonight for the next iteration of the news site app. So yeah, that's all I've got to show for today about Ajax and Axios, news. What questions do we have? Kat?
I was just wondering if you got a chance to update the script or if we should update it ourselves. So I figured out how to do it. I can post it, but it's probably easier for you to just put it in.
Which script?
So the NPM start, the
Oh,
start
yeah.
script, because right now it wasn't.
This
Or
is
maybe you already updated it.
version. So kind of the opposite. This is based on a much older version because I started with news site 1 and it's just been building it up into this. So the mistake that you're talking about would not be in my package JSON here. But yeah, if you could Slack that out, like the fix that you found, or Slack it to me or put it in Quebec or wherever, then I'll check that out and make some changes. Or do you want to just tell us now what you found?
Oh, yeah, it was just, I don't, is this the 4th? Oh, I'm sorry, you're in the 1st one. Okay. Yeah, I can put it in the Quebec channel. It's just a package JSON for start. You just have to put React script start instead of like what's in there now.
Okay, so just the usual React script starts was good. It's just that one was a mistake.
That one had something else about like a server.
Yep. Yeah, I apologize for that again. That was the previous version of this challenge. Had a different server that you were reaching out to. We've made some updates that I think will make it a little bit more relevant to the rest of the program and your future career. What other questions do we have? No other questions? All righty. Well, thank you everybody for being engaged and following along. Had a lot of really good questions this morning. So I'm going to release you to work on the exercises. There's no paired programming this afternoon. no other evening events. So we're going to have our usual stand down at 5. So yeah, let's go take lunch and then come back at 1:15. Thanks, everybody.